Well, now it is my great honor to introduce a talented American artist who, through his paintings, has further revealed the depth of his compassion and character, the 43rd President of the United States, George W. Bush. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. Sit down. Thank you all, please. You're eating into airtime. Fred, thanks. Thanks for your kind remarks. Thanks so much for inviting me back. I also want to thank John, the trustees, Michael, it's good to see you again, and my buddy Brian Flom, who we'll talk about in a little bit, but he's here, Brian's here. I painted him, and I asked his mother what she thought of the painting, and I always thought he had a face only a mother could love. Anyway, and she liked it, which is a huge relief. Elton, good to see you again. Yeah. Anyway, ready to roll.
All right. Well, Mr. President, as you can see, we have a full house. We are streaming this online and on television, and there have been a number of questions submitted about the book, about your painting, and a few other subjects, and we'll try to get through as many of them as we can. But I just want to mention to those here and online that the book is now available, Portraits of Courage. It's already a top seller on Amazon, or if you go to the Bush Center directly at bushcenter.org, the book is available straight from the source, and I saw on there that there's a special deluxe edition that's personally signed by the President.
Yeah.
And all the proceeds, I think people know this, but it's important to emphasize, all the proceeds of this book will go to the veterans' causes that the Bush Center is serving. Well, Mr. President, the first thing that everyone wants to know is, when did you start painting?
Well, I was an art agnostic for most of my life. It's a terrible admission to make, I know. I get back from Washington, and I wrote a book, and then another book. I'm trying to stay fit. I'm working a lot at the Bush Center there in Dallas, but it wasn't enough. You got to understand, when you're the president, you're going 100 miles an hour, and then the next day it's 0. And I had this kind of anxiousness to keep moving and to learn something. And so I read Winston Churchill's essay, Painting as a Pastime. I'm a big admirer of Churchill. He's a great leader. And he took up painting. And this essay is worth reading. And, you know, I basically said, what the hell, if this guy can paint, I can paint. And so I told that to Laura, and she said, yeah, sure. And I hired an instructor, Gail, and she came over to the house, and she said, you know, what's your objective? And I said, well, Gail, there's a Rembrandt trapped in this body. And so she came back realizing I was serious, and I painted a cube. And then I painted a watermelon. And it was a liberating experience. Not only was it liberating, it was an unbelievable learning experience. So I've been painting ever since, for about 5 years.
Well, the first question we have is from Bettina, and she asks, did you have a history of painting as a child earlier in your life? And did your mom tape any of your school paintings on the refrigerator?
Well, I'm sure I was a finger painter. No. Bettina, you know, I just wasn't all that interested in art. And now I am. So it goes to show you can teach an old dog new tricks. You know, it's interesting, when you get to be our age, 70, and you're sitting around with your pals, you know, there's only 2 topics of conversation generally. What medicines are you taking? And how are your grandkids? And my buddies say, man, you got a passion for painting. I said, yeah, you ought to try it. I can't paint, they say. I said, you know, it's funny. I said the same thing till 5 years ago. I'm living proof to tell you that you don't know what you can do unless you try it. And so my call for aging baby boomer is leg it out, you know, run to the finish line. And painting has enabled me to do that.
Next question is, what medicines are you taking and how are your
Oh, the grandkids are great. Very strong, Fred. I didn't think you had it in you, but
Trying my best, Mr.
awesome.
President.
Very good.
Next, it's a question from Janet. She said, you started painting farm animals and world leaders. When did you decide to paint wounded warriors? Who was the first and why?
Well, thank you. Actually, what happened was my mother, who can be quite plain spoken, heard I was painting, and she basically said, "You can't paint." By the way, this is a woman, when I told her I was going to run against Ann Richards in 1993, said, "You can't win." And I said, "I damn sure can paint." And so she said, "Paint my dogs." And so I became a pet portrait painter for a period of time. And I painted Bob the cat, and Bernie the cat, and Barney, and then an instructor in Dallas. One of the greatest things any instructor can do is to set new horizons for a student. And my instructor brought over this artist who said, "You ought to paint the portraits of world leaders." And I'm sitting there as kind of a fledgling artist, and I'm saying, this guy thinks I can actually do that? And I did it. And so I've got two instructors now, and one of them was at the house, and said, "I understand you painted these world leaders." And I said, "Yeah." He said, "You ought to paint the portraits of people nobody knows." And it dawned on me that I ought to paint these warriors, who I do know. So at the Bush Center, we have mountain bike rides and golf tournaments with these wounded vets. And like Brian's a biker, and I got to know Brian, and then I started studying their stories. And the first guy I painted was Major Chris Turner, and I was sitting next to Turner at a dinner, and I said, "Why are you here?" He said, "Because I can't get out of my mind seeing a buddy of mine killed." And I paint from pictures and or photos, and as I'm painting Turner, I'm thinking about what that must be like in his mind. And so it's the first one in there, and he then writes me a letter later, and as a result of standing up at our event, he's much more comfortable talking about the invisible wounds of war. One of the real problems we face is there's a huge stigma. Brian will tell you, he's working with a lot of troops, and they don't want to talk about it. They think people won't understand me, or I won't get promoted, or I'll never get hired. And so they keep it inside, which oftentimes leads to self-medication. Turner writes me a letter saying, standing up and talking about it has enabled me to start sharing my story more and more, which is step one to seeking help. And so I repainted Turner. I've only painted two people in the book. I painted the same portrait again. And I was trying to show people how one can improve when you deal with the stigma and seek help. And I was hoping to show people that I improved as a painter as well.
The next question from Isabella follows up on a little bit of what you were saying. It was, what is the process for painting one of your portraits? Do they sit in the studio? Do you paint from photos? And do they get to see and approve it? And have you ever had somebody who was an unhappy subject?
Yeah, my wife. I painted Laura one time. I thought it was a pretty good painting. And at first it was too anguished, and then it was too this, and then it was too that. I finally said, forget it. I did paint my mother for her 90th birthday, and it was a painting of her walking her two dogs on the beach in Kennebunkport, Maine. But in order to deal with the angst that Laura had showed me, I painted Mom from the back. I do paint from photos. I've never, the only person I painted live is me. So one of my instructors convinced me to paint myself looking in a mirror. And it's a pretty grim looking expression on the face because it's hard to paint and smile while you're looking in a mirror. And so, no, I never run it by. I didn't run it by the vets. I was just hoping beyond all hope. They liked it. I was nervous about some of them. I wasn't nervous about Brian's. I think it's a good painting. Some of them, you know, there's a guy in there named Todd. When you read the book, Todd wrote us a letter about what it was like to be in war. And when I was painting Todd, he told us he had night sweats. And I was thinking about what it's like to have night sweats. And so it's a pretty dark painting, in a sense. And I saw Todd at MacDill in Tampa 2 days ago. And I said, let me show you your painting. And he said, man, that's really good. I said, Todd, you know, look, I'm no longer the commander-in-chief. You can tell me the truth. And he liked it, and it was a great relief for me. I think he liked it because I captured the anguish he felt. But he doesn't feel it anymore. And so, you know, I wish I could repaint him. But, you know, the book's out.
A question from Meredith, and she asks, which of the Wounded Warrior portraits was the toughest one for you to paint?
Well, they're all tough in a way, when you think about it, because every one of these men and women have, some of them have very physical wounds of war, and some of them, all of them have one way or the other PTS or traumatic brain injury. And so when you think about that it was hard to do. On the other hand, you know, I had such great pride in knowing them. See, look, I'm a baby boomer, which means Vietnam War. Remember what it was like when there was a draft and a war? A lot of people didn't understand it. There was huge angst, and when the vets came home, they were treated despicably. And so we get attacked, and I made it abundantly clear that, you know, we're going to defend the country, and millions volunteered. It's a totally different attitude, and to be able to salute people who volunteered in the face of danger was a high honor. And so oftentimes I thought about the integrity and the courage of those who were willing to volunteer to wear the uniform. And so in painting them, I had a lot of pride in painting them. And, you know, they were, I guess the toughest was the one with me and Melissa Stockwell dancing. So Melissa Stockwell was a first lieutenant, the first woman to lose her leg in combat. Fabulous athlete, by the way, wins a bronze medal at the Paralympics in Rio this year in the triathlon. And I'm sitting next to Melissa after one of our bike rides, and she said, let's dance. I said, no, I don't want to dance. I'm not a very good dancer. And anyway, she convinced me to dance, and so I painted Melissa and me. The easy part was her, the hard part was me, because for most of the painting, I looked like Alfred E. Newman. Remember him?
Oh, yeah. He ran for president.
Yeah, what me worry. Yeah, he did.
Mr. President, Caroline from Maryland asks, where do you usually do your painting? Who cleans up after you? And how long does it take you to do a portrait from start to finish?
Yeah, that's a great question. I paint upstairs at our house. I built a studio there. I've got a studio at the ranch, and I've added one in Kennebunkport. And so I've got places where I can retreat to. And I clean up most of the time. Laura's a neat Nick. And oil painting is not neat. I mean, I spread like phthalo blue. I limit my palette, by the way, to 2 yellows, 2 reds, and phthalo blue and a white, which teaches you how to mix colors. And phthalo blue is a very powerful blue. And like you got just a little nick on your finger, and you happen to not get it totally clean, and you lie down on the white bedspread. Phthalo blue. And so I try to, I'm not a very good cleaner, to be frank with you. This took me a year to paint the 98 portraits. A painting is really never done. I mean, I look at some of these portraits and say, gosh, I wish I could put them back on the easel and keep painting, but at some point, you gotta just call it quits. And so I lived with these portraits for, you know, a year, some more complete than others. And I would go upstairs and I'd look at O'Brien and say, I think I better touch him up a little more. And so it's a never-ending process. And so I can't answer that question.
Well, Michael in Greenwich asks, have you ever been unhappy with one of your paintings and tossed it aside? Have you ever done
Yeah,
them all
all the
again?
time.
Is that right?
Yeah. A lot of times I'll paint and then I'll get in bed and think about it and then hustle upstairs and scrape it all off. That's the great thing about oil painting, because you can paint, scrape. I tried acrylics, but it dries so fast that there's no scraping. And yeah, all the time. Yeah. The good thing about oil is you can keep painting over it until you get it where you're comfortable.
There were some questions beyond the painting, and more of those to come back to, but here, a question from Betty in Washington, D.C. She writes, in a time that some would call uncertainty, what can you tell the younger generation of our country to do to renew the sense of belief and optimism in America that Ronald Reagan embodied?
Yeah, read history. I mean, there have been a lot of tough. I remember somebody telling me right after 9/11, "You've had the toughest presidency." I said, "Not even close." How about Abraham Lincoln, when the country was at war with each other? Or I just talked about a period of time that is so vivid in my mind still, 50 years later, and it was a tough period. And what she's got to understand is that our nation goes through divisive and tough times, but there's something unique about us. We've got a spirit that can't be extinguished, and that's why I'm so optimistic about the future of the country. And one reason I'm really optimistic, think about this. Millions wore the uniform. They got PhDs in life at a young age. And so back on subject here. And so the fundamental question is, can we help them transition? Because they're the leaders of the future. And that's what this whole project is about. Helping people take the skill set they learned in the military and transition them to bring those skills into civilian life. And there's a real challenge. There's a military-civilian divide. A lot of it has to do with language. Guy applies for a job. Vice President of Human Relations says, "What's your skill set?" And he says, "Sniper." Well, I don't think we need one this year. But if the person had said, "I'm disciplined, I work hard, I'm a team player, I believe in personal responsibility, I can take pressure," all of a sudden, the civilian takes a different look. And so one of the challenges we have as a society is understanding how the military thinks, and the military understands how civilians think. A lot of work's being done on that, by the way.
A question.
So I'm optimistic, yeah. So the kids have got to understand the history of the country, and you'll see there's a resiliency to us that should make people optimistic. My concern is that the rhetoric in politics can get so out of hand these days that good people say, "I don't want to get involved in politics." But it's been that way. They used to call Abraham Lincoln an ape. I mean, so this isn't the first time that there's been name calling in politics. I think there might have been some names called at me at one time. I'm not
sure. Kathy in Chicago asks, or writes, "We were so glad to see your dad make it to the Super Bowl for the coin toss just days after leaving the hospital. How is he doing, and how is your mom?"
They're both great, given their limitations. Dad can't walk. He's confined to a wheelchair, and yet his spirit is joyful. I went to see Dad 3 years ago, I think it was, in the ICU unit at Methodist Hospital in Houston. And he was, I don't know if you've ever been to an ICU room, but it's not real warm. Anyway, so, and I said to Dad, "You know, Dad, my library's opening in 3 months, and sure want you there." And his voice was incredibly weak, and he said, "I'll be there, son." And I left, kind of tearful, thinking, "Yeah, probably not." And sure enough, when we opened up the library, one of the most important thing for me, I mean, it was nice to have all the former presidents, and the weather was great, and a lot of friends were there, but Dad was on the stage. And that flipping the coin reminded me of him being there for the library opening. I mean, this guy has got a huge desire to live. And, I've often thought about it. I wrote a book about him, Fred, and I thought about it. It had to have started when he was 19 years old, floating in a raft off the island of Chichijima, and, worried about the Japanese capturing him and, of course, killing him if they captured him. And Mom's doing fine. She's shrinking. And as she does, her voice gets louder. But she's a piece of work, is what she is. Don't tell her I said it.
Just our secret.
Yeah.
Mr. President, a question from the audience. Why did you criticize President Trump recently after not criticizing President Obama for 8 years?
So here's what happens. I'm asked the question, do I believe in free press? And the answer is absolutely, I believe in free press, as should every other American believe in free press, because the press holds people to account. Power is very addictive, and it's corrosive if it becomes central to your life. And therefore, there needs to be an independent group of people who hold you to account. And so I answered that question. Of course, the headlines were Bush criticizes Trump. And so therefore, I needed to say, there should be a free and independent press, but it ought to be accurate. I made the decision after my presidency not to criticize President Obama, and I feel the same way about President Trump. And people say, why? First of all, the office of the president is more important than the occupant. And I believe it undermines, the office of the presidency. Secondly, I understand there's a lot of critics. And I don't want to make the president's job worse, no matter what political party it is. It's a hard job. And I think if a former president's out there second guessing, it's going to make it harder. And I want anybody who's president to succeed. We're all in this deal together. And so I understand sometimes my remarks can be construed as criticism. They're certainly not meant to be. And after I finish this book tour, you probably won't hear from me for a while. I like privacy now. The thing about the presidency is, as people say, thank you for the sacrifice. It's not a sacrifice to serve a country you love. But you do sacrifice anonymity. I mean, I can't walk down Madison Avenue in New York without drawing flies, I mean, maybe I ought to put that a little better, without drawing a lot of attention. And, so I, to the extent that I can have privacy, I like it. And that's what art's done. It's given me a chance to kind of not be totally inside yourself, but it is I mentioned a learning experience, but it's also very, it's amazing how time moves, which is a little scary when you're 70.
Bertha from Ridgecrest writes, the Bush family has always been viewed as standing for civility in politics. Are politics less civil today than in the past? And when did things change and why?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think politics has always been, a rough sport. There's always, and again, if you read history, there's a lot of cases where in campaigns there was slander and, people saying bad things about each other. I think what's changed, however, is how people get their news. So believe it or not, I'm really the first BlackBerry or first email president. It's just the email or the BlackBerry was a government issue right at the end of Bill Clinton's time. And the reason I make that point is technology has changed so dramatically and so quickly, as has the dispersal of news. And so in the old days, it was the three, ABC, NBC, and CBS. And now it's from people get news and information from all over the place. And part of the issue with this new these new dispersal agents is that you can be anonymous. There's no responsibility. There's no accountability whatsoever, and which lends itself to, some pretty angry messages going out. And the danger, of course, as I mentioned earlier, is that good people say, I don't want to get involved, and that's a huge problem, because our system is really only as good as the willingness of good people to be involved with it.
A question from Michael in Buffalo. Ronald Reagan had the famous line of asking, are we better off than we were 4 years ago? Is the world a more dangerous place than it was 4 years ago?
The world is a dangerous place. And again, this may be taken as criticism of one of my successors, and I don't really mean it to be. There is a lesson, however, when the United States decides to not take the lead and withdraw. Vacuums can be created when U.S. presence recedes, and that vacuum is generally filled with people who don't share the same ideology, the same sense of human rights and human dignity and freedom that we do. And there's an isolationist tendency in our country, and I would argue that's dangerous to our national security and doesn't befit the character of the country.
You mentioned you talked a little bit about social media. Well, I looked on Twitter for the account of @George W. Bush, and it was described as locked.
Yeah.
Do you tweet?
No.
And do you recommend it to others?
Yeah, that's a loaded question. No, I don't tweet. And, if there is a Twitter account under my name, somebody else is running it out of the Bush Center. This is an interesting question. So how do you, we do good things at the Bush Center, but the only way I make news is if I criticize my successor or criticize my party. And so the fundamental question is, how can you get good news out so that people, for example, who are supporting our center, they can find out about it? And these, like Twitter and Instagram and these things, are useful ways for us to communicate with a group of people that are interested in what we're doing. And so I guess we do. I don't. I do FaceTime with my... Well, that's high tech, isn't it?
That's right.
Cutting edge with my grandkids. It's like watching a home movie every day. It's awesome. By the way, they're doing well.
Good.
Yeah.
Nice. And those medicines that you're taking?
Yeah, too many to count, Fred. Too many to count.
From your 8 years as America's leader, what advice might you give those who lead our country today? I know you've talked a little bit about what you don't want to do, but what advice might you give those who are thinking of running in the future?
Yeah. My advice starts with know what you don't know, and find people who do know what you don't know, and listen to them. My advice is that the job is different once you get in. It looks one way, and then you get in the Oval Office, and it looks different. Trust me. And my advice, though, is if you're thinking about it, go for it. Unless, of course, your whole life is wound up in whether you win or lose. Then don't go for it. My dad never won the state of Texas until 1988. So he loses in 64. He loses in 70. He loses to Ronald Reagan in 1980. And because, and I think this, we're not very good at psychobabble, but I think because his priorities were his faith in his family and his friends, that loss, while it stung, was tolerable. And then he wins in 1988 and becomes president of the United States. It's hard to believe, isn't it? You can't win your home state 3 times, and you end up being president, which I think speaks volumes about the question you just asked, which is take risk. But make sure you got the right foundation on which to take risk.
Some more questions about painting, if we could. Would you have painted in the White House if you knew you had these skills?
Those are like, there's no do-overs. I mean, would I have taken down the sign, "Mission Accomplished," on the USS Abraham Lincoln? Yeah, I would have. I don't know. It's a good question. I doubt it. I mean, it is a all-consuming job. You think about the presidency and the problems you're dealing with and issues you're dealing with all the time. And what's startling is when you're not president, because mankind can adjust to the environments in which they live, pretty adaptable. And the next day, like in Crawford, after you have to go get the coffee yourself, you wake up and realize you no longer have that sense of responsibility. And it's pretty startling. It's pretty startling. And so I guess my answer to your question is, the reason you have the sense of responsibility is because the job is all-consuming.
Do you see the world differently now through the eyes of an artist?
I do.
In what ways?
Well, I was on Ellen DeGeneres' show today, and who, by the way, is a very fine person. And I looked in her eyes, and I'm saying, I can mix that color. I see colors and shadows that I never did before. I see the sky differently. And so, yeah, I do. It's, I don't know if it's made me a more centered person or a more sensitive person. I don't know, all that stuff. But I know this, that it has changed my life to the better.
Does Laura paint with you or
No.
separately? Or
Nor does she play golf. No,
by whose choice?
Yeah. Well, she doesn't like golf. And no, she's not a painter. She is a positive critic. She's helpful. Laura's got a really good eye and loves art. And, she's made some very meaningful and positive suggestions and some not so positive suggestions. But she takes a great interest in the art, Fred, and with this exhibit, all these paintings are going to be displayed at the Bush Center starting today. And they had a huge crowd, by the way, I heard. And so Laura went over there to make sure that the colors on the walls worked well with the paintings, and she's taken a big interest in the project. And like my mom, she is my biggest fan. I mean, they're unbelievably positive. I guess it's to encourage me to keep doing it.
You once said, if you aim for big change, you shouldn't expect to be rewarded by short-term history.
Yeah.
Do you feel that history has misjudged you or has been fair to you?
I don't think it's judged me yet properly, because I think it's impossible to judge a president in the short term. I think there has to be the reach of time to be able to analyze the decisions the president makes and its consequences over time. And so I wrote decision points, and thank you for pointing it out, because I wanted people to at least have an understanding of why I made the decisions I made. Regardless of whether or not you agreed with them, at least you ought to try to learn why. And I also wrote it, and I put in the introduction, that it would be a data point for future historians. So if they're genuinely sincere about trying to find out, my place in history, then they ought to read this book, not as the data point, but as a data point. And so, we've got this library down there, very much like the Reagan library here. It's full of all kinds of archives. And, some of the stuff hasn't been declassified yet, but it will be. And historians will come and research. And in order to, I think, write an objective history, there has to be more presidents follow me. So it enables one to see perspective. And so I'm not that worried about it. I really am not. I gave it my all, and that's all you can do.
Right. What would people be surprised to learn about you since you left the Oval Office?
That I'm a painter. When I wrote that book, the first one, I was thrilled to be able to say, you know, a lot of people are going to be shocked about this book. They didn't think I could read, much less write. And so, you know, I think they'll be surprised at that. You know, I'm not sure what else. I think they're surprised I'm not out there bloviating all the time about my successor. And, you know, I should have given you this answer. When President Obama was president, I used to get a lot of calls from the heartland saying, you need to speak out. Now I'm getting calls from the coast saying, you need to speak out.
This next question is back to your paintings. It's human nature to be private about wounds and scars. How did you get the subjects of your paintings to open up and reveal an aspect of themselves that many of us might choose to hide?
Yeah, it's a great question. Earn their trust is the first thing. And I think I was able to earn their trust several ways. One, I told our troops and their families that as president, I would support them 100%. And I think they saw that. Secondly, you know, when you're riding mountain bikes with people, there's a lot of camaraderie, you know, a lot of you know, needling, but it's a way to earn somebody's trust. And we set it up so that our vets can speak, and we encourage them to be, you know, open. Some more open than others. But when you're sitting there as a vet, I suspect, and another pal gets up and talks about an invisible wound, it gives you confidence to speak yourself. And so here's what's important to understand. The challenge for society is to get a vet to, you know, get rid of the stigma. The best people to do that are vets. You know, if somebody comes out of combat and goes into, you know, a doctor's office and says, I got a problem, and the doctor really doesn't understand how to speak to that person. Mm-hmm. But if somebody seeks out Brian, who dealt with PTS, by the way, and says, I got these issues, Brian can say, I understand what you're saying, man. And the other aspect is what works. And so we've got this a wellness alliance that we're raising money for, which mates up, you know, these peer-to-peer counseling groups, Red, White, and Blue, Team Rubicon, with groups that work. UCLA, for example, has got a fabulous brain center. The Cohen Centers, Langone Center in New York, NYU. And these are places that are, have proven that they're able to help these vets who want help to begin with. And so that's why we're doing what we're doing, yeah. And so anyway, they talk about it, some more than others. Turner, look, I'm sitting next to Turner. I mean, yeah, probably made me a little nervous, I suspect, sitting next to the former commander-in-chief. And I said, why are you here, Turner? And he opens up, like, boom. And it was a part of his healing process, it turns out. And, you know, I don't know why Turner told me what he told me, but as a result, Turner's now a healer himself. He's part of the peer-to-peer counseling network.
In talking about these groups that serve veterans, I know the website mentions that 80% of the organizations that serve veterans raise less than $100,000 a year.
Yeah.
What can we do to help? What can Americans
well,
do to help?
The first question is, do the 80% that raise $100,000 a year do good work? And so therefore, there's a, you know, pretty confident still on our website is this opportunity to take a look at the characteristics one ought to be looking for before they give money to an organization. I mean, the amazing thing is how the response to our vets this time compared to the Vietnam War is overwhelming. And I think there's 35,000 or some NGOs set up to help our vets, some extraordinary number. And the real challenge is what works and what doesn't work. And so, look, we don't want to be the jury at the Bush Center, but we do want to highlight programs that we know are effective. And like Team Rubicon's an interesting example, started by a really cool guy who takes vets and puts them into, you know, like where a hurricane is hit or a earthquake is hit. And they're part of helping the locals recover. And it's a peer-to-peer counseling group. You've got vets dealing with the same issues, all serving somebody else, which, by the way, is also part of healing. In the book, there are a number of people who are recovering nicely, because they're now working to help somebody else's life improve. And by the way, you don't have to be a vet to realize the benefits of serving your mankind, a fellow man.
You mentioned on the site also that there's a lot of talk about the 1%, but you point to the 1% being the warriors who defend the remaining 99% of Americans.
Yeah. I thought you were talking about the 1% financial.
No, this is the...
That's not me.
The warriors.
I'm on a government pension.
What can the government...
$200,000 a year less my Medicare premium.
Is there something that the government can be doing better for veterans?
You know, look, the VA has got some very good programs. I've talked to many vets who say I've been helped by the VA. I've also talked to vets who get frustrated by the VA. So step one is to make sure that the VA is responsive. But the best way for the VA to work is to do joint ventures with private sector programs that are effective. And by the way, the new head of the VA and the former head of the VA is very receptive to that idea. And, you know, we intend to, you know, we're gaining some credibility in the vet field for understanding and knowing what we're talking about, and they want our input to make sure that the help that every vet deserves is as seamless as possible. I'm told this by the former Secretary of the VA. This is an interesting fact, that part of the reason why the PTS, notice I've dropped the D, it's not a disorder, it's an injury. Who wants to be labeled as somebody with a disorder? You know, you're going to hire somebody with a disorder, you're more likely to hire somebody that has an injury. And what was the brilliant point I was going to make?
What the government can do?
Yeah, and so this guy says there's no question that the pipeline is getting clogged for PTS. That's right, notice I dropped a D. And 70. And it turns out Vietnam vets are beginning to show symptoms of PTS now, after all these years. So they've been in combat, and they come home, and they're raising their families, and they got a job, and they retire. And they're going, something's wrong. And they check into the VA because they're exhibiting symptoms of PTS. And all of a sudden, you've got, you know, Vietnam vets, there's a lot of them, beginning to head into the VA. And so the VA's got to deal with it. That's why these joint ventures are really important, so that that as many people can get help as quickly as possible without frustrating our vets. The problem with frustrating a vet that's just come out of combat is if he doesn't get help immediately, there's a threat of self-medication. And Brian will tell you there's a lot of that. And the challenge is to, you know, prevent that from happening as best as we can. By the way, I used to self-medicate. I quit drinking in '86.
Who will be the subject of your next portrait and why?
Actually, it's an interesting question, me. So I looked at a lot of paintings of past masters, and turns out they paint themselves a lot. We're kind of a, I guess, kind of a arrogant lot. And but one reason why you do that is because if you foul it up, it doesn't upset anybody. So Cedric Huckabee, one of my instructors, paints these giant portraits. He's the guy that suggested I paint vets. He's a fabulous painter, by the way. You ought to Google him. And they're big faces. This guy happens to be an African American, and he's painted the faces nobody knows. He knows them because there's relatives and people he grew up with, and they're great paintings. And so he said, you ought to paint a huge portrait, 6 foot big. And so it's me. And my face on 6 foot canvas. That's a lot of face. And so I'm working on that. It takes a long time. And so Cedric, is helping me through this. And it turns out each part of your face becomes almost like a portrait unto itself. You know, you can spend like 4 or 5 days on an ear because it's so big until you get it right. And so I'm doing that right now. It's a fascinating experience. And then I painted Freddie. Now Freddie, so Laura and I go to the SPCA in Dallas. And we want to see it. A great friend of ours has donated quite a bit of money to this. It's supposedly one of the best in the country, and so I wanted to go see it. And we get in there, and there is a dog foster mother holding this little tiny puppy. And of course, they have to tell us the story that this dog had been abandoned in a construction site along with brothers and sisters. The others had been adopted. And they had to hold Freddie back, name is Freddie, because he wasn't eating very well. And so Laura picked up the dog. And it was over. And so my aide is named Freddie Ford. And he happened to be in the line of sight. And I said, okay, the dog's now named Freddie. I don't know if he thought it was an honor or not, but I painted him. Guy's awesome, by the way. I don't know if you've ever done this with your dog, but we did a DNA. Yeah, to find out, like, you know, how unpure Freddie is. So he's got one whole line that says mixed breed. And he's got another line that says Chow, Bichon, Staffordshire Terrier, which as I understand is a pit bull, and Border Collie. He's an awesome little guy, by the way.
Have you ever thought about being an art instructor?
No. I'm still an art pupil. You know, every brushstroke's a learning experience. And that's why it's important to have people around who understand that and are willing to help you kind of reach out, continue to press. And, you know, I used to paint real tight. So if you look at those world leaders, there's not much expression in it. I mean, it looks like Tony Blair or, you know, Putin or Angela Merkel, but there was no confidence and not a lot of paint on it. And some of these warriors' paintings have got a lot of paint on it and big brush strokes. And it's just an evolving style. And my instructors helped me gain the confidence necessary to paint that way. And anyway.
This one's anonymous, but I should ask it anyway. It says, would you be available to do a portrait of our family for their Christmas card?
No.
And it looks like Brad Freeman's handwriting.
Yeah. No, I wouldn't. Here's the problem. I mean, people say, well, you paint something for charity. You paint one for charity. You spend the rest of your life painting for charity. And so, no, I'm not going to do that. Thanks.
Okay.
Nor will I ever sell one. You know, these are this collection here of 98 paintings will go giving it to the Bush Foundation Endowment Fund, and you know, it may be worth something 30 years from now. If they start running out of money, then you know, they can sell it. I did make a G clay, which Brian's going to get. I don't know if you got it yet or not. So I made a G clay, which is a fancy word for a sophisticated copy of each painting. I promised to only make one copy per portrait, and I'm going to send it to each vet.
That's great. A couple questions about portraits specifically. And this one says, it says that artists who seek to do portraits have to be the toughest. You can mispaint a landscape or a still life, and who's going to complain?
Exactly.
But if you decide to capture the image of another human on canvas, you better get it right. Mr. President, have any of your subjects complained?
Well, you know, Laura, I actually painted Jenna's baby once, Mila, and of course she complained. Pretty impressionistic. I thought it was nice. She didn't like it. Then I painted another and didn't like it. And so I finally painted something that looked like the Gerber baby.
This question's also about specifics of portraiture. It says, portraiture is considered the most complex form of art, requiring not just artistic skill, but also an insight into a subject's character. That usually means a special rapport needs to develop between the artist and the subject. Did that occur with you, and do you remain in contact with the subjects of your paintings?
I do. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think in order to make a portrait work, you have to have feeling about, you know, a feeling about who you're painting. And as I mentioned earlier, I paint with great respect for each person. I stay in touch with them. As a matter of fact, Brian has been rode at the ranch, came back to the ranch to ride again. We have got what we call Club 43, which are people who've been to our events, and we expand it every year, and we hope the alumni come back. They formed bonds among themselves. It's a network of vets, for example. I saw 4 vets on the Today Show the other day. I went to McDill and saw 5 others. I saw 2 today at Ellen. And so, yeah, I stay in touch with them. And, you know, some write in, some send pictures in, and they're my friends.
It's great. You've talked about the art, the paintings. What inspired you to make the book out of the paintings?
Well, that's a good question. You know, I guess it's a little risky to put your paintings out there. I mean, somebody may not like them, but you know what? Some people didn't like some of my decisions, so I'm kind of used to it. Because I wanted to raise money for the foundation, and I wanted to tell these stories. I think when you read them, you'll be moved, and because they're, you know, they're stories of courage, injury, recovery, willingness to help others. And I also wanted to highlight the invisible wounds. That's my biggest concern. I mean, the prosthetics are great. Look, I'm riding mountain bikes with people who've lost a leg, some of whom been back in combat on one leg. Sondheim on the cover of the book, Self, the first portrait in there. They lose their legs and they've been in combat twice. I mean, the prosthetics are great. It's the invisible wounds that concern me. And so this book is a way to highlight that. And hopefully it'll inspire, you know, people to help, and vets to come forward and talk about it. You know, caregivers to rethink the care they're giving if it's not working. It's really to call, you know, it's to call people to a very important cause. And I've got a platform still. It's not quite as big as the old one, but I intend to use it to help our vets for the rest of my life, and this is just one way to do so.
Mr. President, we've just about run out of time, but I'd like to thank you for doing this book. I was fortunate enough to get an advance copy, and I just can't say how inspirational it is to read this book, and what a great gift it is to give to people in the military families. And I would just urge everybody to pick up a copy, Amazon, or go to bushcenter.org.
Or Washington Post. That's an inside joke.
And especially,
he's doing a fine job, by the way.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. I would say especially the opportunity to have the deluxe book, which is signed by the president and the author, the painter and the author, is just a wonderful thing. And I would say encourage people to get that if you can.
Thanks,
Thank you for
Fred.
joining us,
Yeah,
Mr.
thank
President.
you all for coming.